I thought I'd take this opportunity on what is fast approaching the 5th anniversary of the emergence of the coalition government to reflect. I've called this little lecture Coalition from the Inside, to reflect on Liberal Democrat role in that coalition, and indeed the more general prognosis for a junior party in coalition. And I think regardless of the outcome, Roger's the great psephologist, I'm sure he could make various predictions of every seat in Wales and every seat in the United Kingdom. Regardless of the outcome of the next election, I think there will be lessons learnt, whether it be my party in coalition again, or indeed other parties, because I think what we're very clear about from all the opinion poll data that's been is now emerging is that this is the most uncertain election for many, many years. As a candidate in 2010 and as an MP in the preceding 5 years, it was very important to me and it was very important to my party that mechanisms were put in place should we be in the position, as Nick Clegg hoped we would be, of in a coalition situation. He always said that we'd negotiate with the party that had the largest number of votes and the largest number of seats, but that wasn't sufficient for the party. The party needed the reassurance that they would be fully engaged in the process, and there were 3 organs of the party that had to be positively engaged for any coalition agreement to be agreed upon with whichever party. The Parliamentary Liberal Democrat Party, the members of Parliament and the peers, our federal executive, in effect the board of the party, chaired by our party president, elected by every Liberal Democrat member, and a special conference of party members, which in the event was called a week after the election at the NEC in Birmingham. Consent had to be achieved by all 3. It was in effect a triple lock. Parliamentary colleagues assembled at Local Government House in Smith Square after the result of the election was known. And my personal frustration was that we couldn't celebrate the great victory in Ceredigion. The candidate wasn't there. He was summoned down to Local Government House with my colleagues. And the mood was very much tempered by the reality and seriousness of the situation that we faced. This was an opportunity for the party to enter government. That had huge implications not just for the country, but for the party and liberal democracy in Britain. It was not without considerable risk. It must be said, doing our deal with the traditional opposition, the Conservative Party, which some liken to supping with the devil. I couldn't possibly comment on that, but there was that mood. And of course that risk has indeed been borne out by the deep disappointment for the party in the opinion polls, the destruction of our very proud record of by-election victories in parliaments going back to the 1970s, and of course the erosion of our local government base. Some of us didn't want the fait accompli that it was going to be a deal with the Conservative Party regardless. We thought it was important that we entered talks with the Labour Party, in an attempt to broker a deal with them, but of course the maths conspired against that, as did the attitude of many leading lights in the Labour Party. But I think we owed it to the party, and all parties are coalitions, I think we owed it at least to the progressive left of the Liberal Democrats to at least have a try. And I wasn't privy to those detailed discussions, though of course David Laws and Andrew Adonis have written very detailed accounts of the discussions that took place. Looking back as a Liberal Democrat backbencher representing Ceredigion, I remember with my other colleagues, Jenny Willott and Roger Williams, being very preoccupied with ensuring that the case for devolution was strongly made in the coalition document, the settling of the issue of the referendum, the setting up of a commission, as it turned out the Silk Commission, and indeed bringing forward a Wales bill to provide more fiscal responsibility to the Welsh Assembly. I believe it was a mistake in hindsight in that document to accept the very narrow constraint that where there were disagreements with the Conservative Party, most notably on tuition fees and other issues like nuclear power, Liberal Democrat MPs would be expected to simply abstain. By implication, that meant giving up the fight on those issues and enabling the Conservative Party to achieve their own objectives. I took some comfort, though, from the fact that Liberal Democrat MPs actually read the document. The coalition document that was drawn up was presented to each and every Liberal Democrat MP to consider, something I'm not sure, in fact I know the Conservative members of Parliament, the other side of the coalition, didn't have that opportunity. Kirsty Williams, as our leader, was fully engaged in the process, but not unreasonably when you look at the weighty document itself. We were all somewhat lost on the detail. Such was the speed of events at the time. But they were heady days. The first months of the coalition government were characterised by that image of the Downing Street Rose Garden, two young men, charismatic leaders, some would say joined at the hip. The only divergence at one point seemed to be the colour of their ties. But there was an emphasis in those early months that this was a coalition government. I remember those mandarins in the party that are now charged with image making, insisting that any of us had to undertake any interviews would have to mention the word coalition in there at some point. But I contrast that with the last 6 months, perhaps a marriage gone somewhat sour, if not anticipating solicitors' letters. The Electoral will make their judgment on that. But with hindsight, I think from a Liberal perspective, the need to push for clarity, the need to push for that distinctly Liberal Democrat agenda should have been started much early on. Mr Cameron talks freely and without any inhibition these days about Liberal Democrat policies on pensions and tax thresholds as if they were his own. And we allowed that to happen. And I'm not sure I have an answer for that. I'm sure Plaid Cymru would agree too that in the One Wales agreement with the Labour Party, they, the junior partner, had the same difficulty in claiming ownership of policies which were adopted by the larger party in coalition. On to the practicalities. My colleague Sir Nick Harvey, the MP for North Devon, has talked and written extensively on the role of Liberal Democrat ministers in government, and he looked at the situation as an insider, being a Minister of Defence for some time, from the backbenches. And he concluded, or has concluded, that should a coalition be formed again after the next election, then a minimum of 30 ministers across the government would be required. I don't imply there any prediction on the number of Liberal Democrats to be elected after the next election. I'm an eternal optimist. He assures me that were there to be any shortfall, and were he to be in that position, there are now ample Liberal Democrat peers, indeed 108 of them, I think, at the last count, to make up the numbers. But the point behind that was that there were a range of government departments, have been a range of departments over the last 5 years who have not had any Liberal Democrat ministerial presence at all. Furthermore, there was no machinery in those early days of the coalition in the House of Commons for us to preserve our identity as a party. And I can almost remember the feeling of shock having entered the coalition for those of us on the back benches of what happens next in terms of those of us, not just the voting fodder for the coalition government, but in terms of the preservation of the party. Now, in terms of the House of Commons procedures, the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats were simply morphed into coalition members with no thought as to how exactly that would work. The House of Commons procedures did not allow for any separate identities within the coalition. Gone is the Liberal question at question time. That's been now handed over to the nationalist parties who take it in turns at Prime Minister's questions. Gone is the Liberal Democrat opposition debate time. Gone are official Liberal Democrat front bench speeches. Now, the speedy solution drawn up was a system of backbench Liberal Democrat committees designed to promote the party's views in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, co-chaired by one Member of Parliament and one Lord. The committees were meant to liaise with those departments with no Liberal Democrat ministers. And I've served on 2 of those committees with vastly different experiences. First, I chaired the Backbench Committee on Political and Constitutional Reform. I felt something of an outsider, not unreasonably, because the Deputy Prime Minister was taking the lead on this. He, the Minister responsible for the constitutional reform agenda. But even there was scope for friction. Advancing the coalition policy on the alternative vote. I have to say the committee and I would argue my party, took the line that we should be pushing again the single transferable vote. I wasn't a member of the government, but I saw my role as somebody who needed to help preserve the Liberal Democrat identity, which had been in part sacrificed for the sake of forming the coalition government. Therefore, the lobbying bill, for instance, I was not able to support the government in the lobbies. Since 2012, I've chaired the Welsh Backbench team, and this came at a very critical time for Welsh affairs, because when I began, there was no Liberal Democrat minister in the Wales office, which at the time, you will not need reminding, was occupied by Mrs Gillan and Mr David Jones. And I have to say it was rather different then to the current tenure of Messrs Crabb and Cairns and Baroness Jenny Randerson. A protocol was designed by Nick Clegg's former Chief of Staff, Norman Lamb MP, to ensure that Liberal Democrat Backbench Committee chairmen in that situation would have access to ministers, would be invited to ministerial meetings. In fact, I was only, with transport, my difficult travel arrangements, difficulties today in mind, the only reason why I couldn't attend the Deputy Prime Minister's meetings was a train service from Aberystwyth, I seem to recall. But we were entitled to attend ministerial meetings. We were also meant to be privy to ministerial statements before they were released to the House of Commons. As part of the Political and Constitutional Reform Group, I also shadowed the government on the Cabinet Office. Francis Maude was and still is the minister. And again, this difficulty wasn't unique, wasn't widespread with every Tory. Francis Maude regularly invited me to his room behind the Speaker's chair, gave me prior notice of ministerial statements. I was invited as a matter of course to his department. But that was not the case in the Wales office. Liberal Democrat chairmen of committees were meant to be part of the furniture of Gwydir House. That memorandum, were the Tories aware of it, and indeed they were, was never enacted. But it is fair to say, as I say, that successive Secretaries of State have become more accessible and more approachable. But the chair of the Welsh Liberal Democrat team, my predecessor in that job, Roger Williams, had no more access to the Secretary of State than anyone else. In fact, I remember the Secretary of State saying, you can come and see me at any time. But that wasn't the point. There were structures in place as part of the coalition machinery, and we were denied them. In short, the relative openness of the current Wales office under Mr Crabb is completely unrecognisable to what it was like in those early important days. Now, within the party, there's been much debate and discussion surrounding the reasons why we didn't have opportunities to have ministers across all government departments. With only 57 members of parliament, it was inevitable that not all would be included. But surely in a true coalition, it would have been imperative to at least have an overview of all government departments. Where there are or have been Liberal Democrat ministers, I know that some of them have found it particularly challenging to have a complete overview of the whole department's work as the sole Lib-Dem in perhaps a team of 4 or 5 ministers. That challenge could have manifested itself by the sheer workload in that department, or indeed a reluctance of Tory ministerial colleagues to share information. Again, ignoring the protocol. And yet this is so important in a junior party in a coalition government. It's meant that, for instance, as we critically debate the future of this country in the European Union, we have had no presence in the last year or more in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office or the Department of Defence, and we see the defence debate taking off in recent days. DCMS has never had, to this day, a Liberal Democrat minister. In the early stages of this Parliament, we had something called the Public Bodies Bill, it was revising the funding of S4C. So we had the twin problem of no minister in the DCMS to lobby, to argue the case for S4C, and we had a Wales office that wasn't allowing us through over the threshold of Gwydir House. It did present problems. Opinion polling from before the election of 2010, and Roger will know more than this than I, clearly revealed mass support for the concept of coalition government, this idea of people of differing political backgrounds coming together for the national good. But I do wonder how the electorate will judge it after this 5 years of coalition. And my hunch is that the experience of a coalition of chalk and cheese, of a centre-left party and the Conservatives has sapped support for the idea of coalition government. There is a perception, the perception being that while I and others have been elected on a clear policy agenda, those policies have been reduced to a mishmash of ideas. Now, I can't accept that, and of course my party will be making the case in the coming weeks and months that far from that we have achieved great Liberal Democrat things, but it is going to be a hard perception to argue against. But if coalition government is to work, then it is essential we get the institutions right. Parties do need to be well prepared. It should be the most natural of resolutions in a hung parliament situation for parties to come together. But not unreasonably, Lib-Dem voters and ex-Lib-Dem voters, and I could say this for the Tories too, but Lib-Dem voters have looked for Lib-Dem policies to be enacted by Lib-Dem ministers. They haven't always been forthcoming, and even if they have, they haven't always been widely publicised. And there's a message there for our friends in the media. We do need people to be educated in the principles of coalition government, and certainly, if that polling evidence is to be believed, this becomes more of a necessity as the country may even have to grapple with the possibility not just of a coalition between two parties, but arrangements between 3 or 4. Now, my most proactive involvement in the coalition narrative has been the new regime in the Wales office, in the leaders' summits convened by the Secretary of State for Wales, concluding with the St David's Day Agreement. I think the approach epitomises a new, albeit rather belated, style of the Wales office, and I do very much commend it. Now, I had the privilege of being part of those discussions, in no sense being a leader. I made it very clear from the outset in those meetings that I would be talking to and on behalf of my party leader, and that's Kirsty Williams, the leader of the Welsh Liberal Democrats. And whilst the devolution of further responsibilities would inevitably and necessarily be enacted, I did feel it rather strange that Westminster politicians were determining the remit of our National Assembly. And it wasn't robust enough, I don't think, for the Secretary of State to simply say, well, the decision has to be taken here. Yes, true, further enhancement of devolution will mean another Wales bill in the House of Commons. But I was concerned about the, I wouldn't say lack, but inadequate dialogue with our colleagues in the National Assembly. And I think, for me at least, that comes from a guttural instinct of being a real devolutionist, ideologically as well as practically. But I'm not sure that can be said of all the party leaders. Maybe it says something about the structure of political parties, that question of leadership. Who is the leader of the Conservative Party in Wales? Who is the leader of the Welsh Labour Party? These are things that have preoccupied politicians in the past. I'm not sure we've resolved them now. The Secretary of State, though, throughout the process, did have bilateral discussions with Assembly leaders. But all 8 of us, the 2 from each party, did only meet on 2 occasions. In those meetings, those 2 meetings at least, 2 of the parties were able to talk with one voice. My party and Plaid Cymru. I'm not sure the same could be said across the board, whether it was competing mandates, whether it was the last vestiges of anti-devolutionary sentiments, I don't know. All 4 parties, with their respective representatives or leaders at either end of the M4, were not likely to agree on everything within the parties, but certainly between them. And that's why, for instance, for my party, it was with deep regret that policing and youth justice will not be devolved as part of the St David's Day Agreement. but as a Liberal Democrat Party committed in our manifesto, which will be revealed shortly, a manifesto endorsing Silk 2, it remains a pledge of the party that we hope to deliver. But the St David's Day process does represent a genuine attempt to achieve a consensus on Silk 2. Silk ended his work urging a debate on those recommendations in the general elections. It was almost him saying, it's over to you now, the politicians, deliberate, reflect on these things in your manifestos, let the electorate decide. And that debate will be had. But at the very least, I don't want to be seen negative about the process, I was part of it, but at the very least, the Secretary of State's initiative will focus more debate on those areas where consensus couldn't be reached. But even at its inception, its remit wasn't always transparently clear. Little detailed time was spent on the next step of devolution, namely the Welsh response to the Smith Commission, though some provisions were reflected on, devolving electoral arrangements to the Assembly, the capacity of the Assembly to change its name. Little time was spent on the critical fair funding case for Wales. And yes, very much welcome the government's late in the day admission that we need a funding floor, but it was very late in the day. It is very late in the day. Parliament breaks up in 2 weeks' time, and we await the details. And the question of an assessment of the funding gap, and what I believe should be the commissioning of Jerry Holtham, so respected in London and Cardiff, would be an important step, indeed an essential step before we can achieve progress. So, how much further are we on the road to devolution post March the 1st? Devolution is moving forward. It is happening under a Conservative stewardship of the Wales Office, but it is coalition policy. The role of Kirsty Williams as leader and Jenny Ransom as Wales Office Minister, and Jenny I think particularly has a very unique understanding of devolution, having served in the National Assembly and in the Wales Office. Their influence should not be understated. I think of all the constitutional commitments made in the coalition agreement, of all the pledges made at the general election, and quite frankly the many disappointments, huge disappointments over the last 5 years, devolution to Wales, the continuing march towards Home Rule, has been one of the success stories, with all three of those original commitments in the coalition document having been delivered. Would we be so far along the road towards Home Rule had it not been for the referendum in Scotland? Manifestly not. But our referendum, I believe, would have been won. It happened beforehand. The Silk Commission would have met and deliberated. The Wales Bill would have been enacted. But what the Scottish debate did do was to ensure that some of the nonsenses in the Wales Bill that some of us argued against at the time, things like the lockstep, the Assembly's capacity to issue bonds, some of those nonsenses were removed, and Silk 2 will not gather dust on some shelf in the Wales Office. And I think that is a reflection, thank goodness, of a more inclusive, much more responsive Wales Office. As a backbencher who occasionally crosses the threshold of Gwydir House, the Gwydir House of 2015 is a much more productive place than the Gwydir House of 2005. I can remember that Parliament 2005, 2010 being told in the Welsh Affairs Select Committee that legislative competence orders, ELCOs, were going to be the new tool of devolution in the future. The spectacle could be written in stone. This was a very efficient method. I mean, I won't say who said it, but go back to the Welsh Affairs Select Committee at the time. You know, that was this picture of the National Assembly for Wales coming to the House of Commons and asking for powers. I think now we're in a much better place, and I think Wales is much more clearly in a defining position of its own destiny. Thank you very much.